Greetings, denizens of the Empire. It's Jabari here. I'm sure the title of this video alone is enough to incite a great degree of emotion and controversy amongst most of you who are watching, and for a multitude of reasons. Additionally, and as per usual, I'm sure that most of the criticism in this comment section will stem from people who have already made up their minds prior to even watching the video at all, and will lack any probability or desire to change their minds. If you are one of those people, it's pretty obvious, so just don't do it. Save us all some time. You only make yourself look like a fool. I also want to make it clear that this is not a happy topic. It's just that I'm incapable of doing any facial expressions aside from smiling, and the real life version of me has been too lazy to fix that. Please fix it. So, since I'm doomed to smile whether I want to or not, I should maybe try to add a little bit of humor to this topic? So, after releasing a couple of videos about the Woman King and numerous comments outright condemning the movie that they evidently didn't even watch, considering they were incorrectly claiming that the movie tried to deny that Africans had any role in the slave trade and that it was some political tool to blame whitey for everything, I decided that no short excerpt from a video was going to sum up such a complex issue, and to be frank, even this dedicated video may still be lacking in summing it up. Alas, we shall try anyway. Additionally, I have compiled some strong historical facts that support all of the context that I will cover regarding the slave trade, as well as the Woman King's accuracy or lack thereof in that respect. Yeah, okay, so how am I supposed to bring humor to a situation so dark? I can't think of any way to possibly make a topic like this into something funny. Maybe we can just—
White men say that he went to Africa and kidnapped our people and throw them on boats and take them to the Americas. 12 million of them. But our Kemet brothers was already in America. We created the Olmec civilization. They just hiding the truth.
No, y'all black people were just selling your own people into slavery like a bunch of savages, and y'all weren't capable of building any civilization. Just mud huts made out of cow shit.
Well, that certainly didn't help, but it did present the topics that I'm going to clarify and debunk that often get tossed out there as absolutes when regarding the history of the transatlantic slave trade. However, the issue was far less black and white than most people think. No pun intended, and believe it or not, the writers of The Woman King seem to have been very well aware of this. While it is true that the plot of The Woman King did bend history a bit for the sake of a good storyline, this is typical of any historical Hollywood film. It's really nothing new. Troy, 300, Braveheart, just to name a few. However, there seems to be quite a bit of a misunderstanding about this movie. Based on the trailer and summary alone, many people have reached the conclusion that the film is nothing more than a political tool used to promote a story of a pro-black feminist fantasy's victory over the evil, slaving white man. However, this really isn't the case, and in the actual movie, the issue is far less simple. The Kingdom of Dahomey was openly portrayed as a slave kingdom, and the topic of the slave trade even came up in court discussions with King Gezo, the Black African King of a Black African Kingdom. In summary, the situation was as follows. The slave trade was Dahomey's primary source of revenue and was also something that was necessary, as their Oyo Empire overlords, another Black African state to the east of Dahomey, demanded tributes in the form of large sums of slaves. So right there we already have slaves from one African kingdom being captured and sold for selfish reasons and being paid as tribute to another African kingdom that wanted them for selfish reasons. However, General Naniska, the lead female general of the Goji, recommended ending this practice of capturing and selling human beings, favoring the sale of palm oil instead. She cited that this constant warfare and slave raiding was primarily a product of the greed of the Oyo Empire, and ultimately part of a looming problem that was even bigger: the ever-growing demand for slaves by European powers. She also emphasized the dehumanization aspect of it, fueled by European perspectives on Africans and their subsequent thirst for conquest over the entire continent, noting how every kingdom around them was slowly being absorbed by European imperial expansion. Everyone in the Dahomeyan court dismissed her ideas and favored the continuation of the slave trade, with the queen even mocking her suggestion, claiming that Nanisca wanted him to become a king of farmers. Again, this completely contradicts the complaints from the critics, claiming that in the movie, the Dahomey were portrayed as anti-slavery. King Gezo was the only person that seemed even a little open to her suggestion, despite arguments from his courtiers to continue the practice. However, his openness was not humanitarian by any means. His concerns were purely political and economic, as he only agreed to Nanisca's proposal if she could prove to him that the palm oil industry could indeed replace the profits generated by the slave trade. He made it clear that if she could accomplish this, then and only then would he accept her proposition. Even still, he only did this out of respect for her, as she apparently helped him usurp the throne from his brother. After this tense discussion, she promptly fought tooth and nail to increase palm oil production throughout the kingdom. This transition from a primarily slave-based economy to a palm oil-driven one during the reign of King Gezo is a historical fact. While slaves were the primary source of revenue for most of the Dahomey Kingdom's 400-year history, it began to shift in favor of palm oil, and by 1850, or 9 years prior to the end of Gezo's reign, palm oil even surpassed slaves in regards to revenue generated, and by 1880, Dahomey was earning more from palm oil than it had ever made from slaves at any point in its long history, with the exception of one particularly high point in the year 1730. With that being said, it is unapologetically true that the Kingdom of Dahomey was indeed in a process of ending the slave trade in favor of palm oil during Gezo's reign.
Yeah, that ain't nothing but a load of bullshit. The only reason why they ended the slave trade was because the British white man made them do it.
Oh, hell no. The white man just wrote down lies. The slave trade wasn't nothing but a myth so they could just steal the land from my black Aboriginal American brothers.
Well, yes, Mr. Bigots, it is true that the British did indeed take a firm stance on outlawing and thwarting the slave trade during this particular period in history, notably with the blockade of Africa, in which a naval fleet of British ships patrolled the West African coast, preventing any would-be slave traders from shipping human cargo to the New World, and there is no doubt that this provided incentive for ending the practice among African kingdoms and European kingdoms alike. However, just the same as King Gezo of Dahomey had ulterior motives, the British had their own opinions on slavery that were not purely the result of empathy. They largely were the result of increasing rebellions and tensions rising throughout the Caribbean, notably the Baptist War in Jamaica, which saw an uprising of some 60,000 black slaves throughout the plantation, as well as the Haitian Revolution, in which slaves ousted whites from Haiti altogether, committing genocide on all those that remained, and founded their own independent black republic in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. In other words, the loss of life and property of white settlers were the main driving factors that led to the abolition of the slave trade. So, I just want to take a moment and pause for a second just to say that I know this isn't exactly the happiest video topic out there, but I can suggest something that can help to change that. I've been using Happy Hippo Herbals products for a few years now, and I've shared them with many friends and family members who had nothing but good things to say about them. Happy Hippo Herbals makes me feel happy and motivated throughout the day and helps immensely with my anxiety and stress. The effects are similar to that of coffee, but generally better and minus the caffeine or the crash. If you'd like to see for yourself, you can check out my promo code or affiliate link down below for a 15% discount. Moving back to the Kingdom of Dahomey, there's another historical fact that we simply cannot ignore. Gezo's brother Adandozan, who reigned from 1797 to 1818, was actively seeking an alternative to the slave trade to combat European dominance in the region, until he was usurped by his brother. And during his reign, we can see that the revenue generated from the slave trade was already in a state of gradual decline, even before the British abolished it. So now that we have established that the slave trade was something endorsed by both African and European kingdoms, there's another simple fact that we can't ignore. The fact that it was ultimately Europeans who were responsible for the sheer scale of it. Prior to the transatlantic slave trade, the West African economy did include slaves, but at its core, it centered primarily around other goods such as gold, salt, ivory, cola nuts, and foodstuffs. The West African economy was also based primarily over land, from the forest regions to the south, up through the grasslands, and transcending the Sahara Desert to the north. In other words, the most lucrative regions were those cities that were positioned between the desert to the north and the green waterways of the Niger River to the south, which have historically been the most wealthy and successful trade hubs. While slaves were also part of the West African economy, the sheer scale was negligible in comparison to what it would become when Europeans arrived. Gold and salt had been by far the most important goods traded for thousands of years. The transatlantic slave trade was spearheaded by Europeans, as human beings were needed for use in their New World colonies, as there was a shortage of labor for their plantations. Trade in human cargo then became their most sought-after commodity, and unfortunately, they had many other significant goods to offer African kings in exchange, notably firearms. This new sea-based economy offset the political and economic balance of the region, causing many kingdoms to vie for power along the Atlantic coast of Africa, rather than the traditional overland routes to and from the Sahara Desert and along the Niger River. And the warfare between these coastal kingdoms in and of itself was a source of many slaves, which were primarily acquired by prisoners of said wars. In many cases, slave raids were conducted by these kingdoms specifically for the purpose of selling them to Europeans on the coast. In exchange, they'd receive European firearms, which they then used to have more wars, capture more slaves, and thus acquire more firearms in a vicious, never-ending cycle. A cycle that was mentioned specifically in The Woman King, during the Niska's proposal to her king about ending the slave trade, which again, he and most of his court were on the fence about doing. Another point of contention that I see tossed around constantly is the fact that the transatlantic slave trade was ultimately ended by the British, yet most discussions of it are centered around the bad intentions of white men.
Yep, I know. I already said that, you dumb nigga. The white man stopped y'all blacks from selling each other.
Hey, hold on. While it is true that the British were indeed the primary players in the international abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, they weren't the only ones. Also, one simply cannot ignore the 200 years that the British partook in the purchase, sale, and mistreatment of African slaves, along with other European nations including Spain, France, and Portugal, who are the primary contributors to its establishment and longevity. Their role in abolishing the slave trade does not simply wipe their slate clean of the several centuries that they partook in it. As mentioned before, the consequences of their actions disrupted the economic and political stability of Africa drastically, and did so for centuries. British, along with other European powers, then proceeded to outright conquer nearly the whole of the African continent mere decades after the slave trade was abolished, leading to even more political and economic instability. This instability continued long after these African nations gained their independence, and the unfortunate state of modern African nations makes this fact quite evident. In fact, a 19th century British trader who visited Benin Kingdom seemed to be very well aware of this fact. As early as 1897, he gave a very powerful statement regarding the active role that the British had on the consequences suffered by African people due to the slave trade. I am not here tonight to give a lecture on the extent and horrors of the slave trade carried on by England in the past, but to remind you, as I would all English-speaking people, that Africa has been brought more or less into this terrible state of savagery and degradation by our own huge traffic across the seas in human flesh, as we set almost every man's land against his neighbors in Africa to procure slaves to fill our ships. Each one shipped by us probably cost the lives of 5 to 10 others, counting the fire, rapine, slaughter, and deaths by the long tedious march to the coast. This brings us to our final discussion about the transatlantic slave trade. The difference in the treatment of black slaves in Africa compared to the way that they were treated outside of Africa. The idea of slavery in the modern era is almost always associated with the form practiced in the New World colonies, an institution in which human beings are owned as property by other human beings and have no more rights than a cow, chicken, or horse. In addition to this, African people were deemed genetically, culturally, and intellectually inferior to whites. With that being said, black people deserved no rights or freedom, and no remorse was had for mistreating them. However, the slavery practiced within the African continent was an entirely different story. While there was some degree of regional variation throughout the continent, generally speaking, slaves within Africa were not treated as if they were innately inferior and still retained rights, even if not very many. While slaves within Africa had very few rights, their poor treatment was only comparable to that of a prisoner or a criminal rather than a subhuman savage. In fact, some African kingdoms even had laws that dictated how you were legally allowed to treat your slaves. An excellent example of this was the Mali Empire, which existed roughly between the years of 1235 and 1670, and it had a constitution that was created around when the empire was founded. It outlined the inalienable rights of all inhabitants within its borders. Known as the Kourakan Fuga or the Mandan Charter, it was comparable to the American Bill of Rights or the English Magna Carta. Article 20 of the Kourakan Fuga explicitly condemned the inhumane treatment of slaves, and it reads as follows. Do not ill-treat slaves. You should allow them to rest 1 day per week and to end their working day at a reasonable time. You are the master of the slave, but not of the bag they carry. This goes to show that while slaves were not the most fortunate or desired people in this society, they were still considered in regards to rights, freedoms, and protections. In fact, a slave by the name of Sakura would eventually rule over the Mali Empire and solidify a reputation as one of its greatest conquerors. Early accounts by the British mentioned how the Ashanti king himself described slaves as stupid and little better than beasts. However, this was strictly in reference to those captured from the northern frontiers of the Ashanti Empire, who were much more primitive than the Ashanti, a pattern recognized in all parts of the world. Notably, the Greek and Roman attitudes towards the northern tribes of their respective regions, like the Germanic and Celtic tribes. It had nothing to do with skin color or race. Despite the unconcealed disdain that the king had for slaves, Ashanti society was structured in such a way that protected slaves from cruelty. Ashanti slave masters were discouraged from abusing them. In fact, slaves were allowed to legally run away from a cruel master, so as long as they swore a powerful oath to a new master. They were also able to legally seek sanctuary in temples if they were being ill-treated by a tyrannical master. Slaves were even allowed the potential to rise to high-ranking positions of society, some resulting in great influence and wealth. This was further possible due to the Ashanti Empire's strategy to solidify unity and national identity of its citizens. This is enforced in one of the empire's 77 imperial laws as follows. It is a capital offense in our new nation for anyone to place any undue emphasis on where their foreparents belonged before they joined the Union. In many societies, status was earned primarily by who your parents were and who their parents were. While this rule was still applicable to a small degree in the Ashanti Kingdom, it was not as rigid of a concept as was seen in other parts of the world. With that being said, it was not uncommon for a wealthy noble to have relatively poor children after their death, as most of their posthumous wealth was confiscated by the royal treasury. On the converse of things, it was not uncommon for slaves to rise to higher positions in their lives, and their ancestral background would not form any barriers to their opportunities. This also meant that the child could not be born into slavery. Meanwhile, the form of slavery practiced in the New World rested solely on the fact that the slave in question was black, and would remain a slave from birth till death with relatively few opportunities to change that, and all of their children would also be slaves solely because they too were black. Just as in Africa, the laws regarding the rights of slaves varied throughout the New World colonies, but for the most part, the abuse, dehumanization, or even murder of a slave by their master resulted in little to no penalties, as slaves were only considered to be a form of personal property, a form of slavery specifically referred to as chattel slavery. In conclusion, those responsible for the transatlantic slave trade came in all colors. The narrative of white men showing up on boats and raiding villages was a relatively rare phenomenon. Most Europeans who attempted this had little to no success, as there were many well-established kingdoms that would have swiftly deployed troops to respond to such incursions. The earliest interactions between the Portuguese and the Dahomey, Jagra, and Mali empires resulted in disaster and forced the Portuguese to pursue more diplomatic approaches in future encounters with West African peoples. The narrative of Africans selling their own countrymen and family members is also false. This monolithic viewpoint that we have in the United States of blacks and Africans being one and the same people simply does not exist in Africa. People throughout Africa require much more than just skin color to be considered the same people. Cultural, linguistic, and religious ties are more important in a manner no different than the way Germans, French, and British people distinguish between one another. Generally speaking, African kingdoms would go to war with other neighboring kingdoms, just as the French did during the Napoleonic Wars. During these wars, they would capture prisoners, a practice that was common in virtually all wars of all time, whether they took place in Europe, Africa, Asia, or elsewhere. However, rather than locking them in dungeons or committing mass executions, it was much more common and much more profitable to sell them to European merchants on the coast as a means of eliminating the threat, demoralizing the enemy, and in all cases, generating revenue. The demand from this trade in human cargo along the coastal regions disrupted the primarily land-based trade routes that were formerly fueled by an economy that was relatively marginal in its slave trading, and instead was primarily gold and salt-based. This coincided with increasingly ambitious European imperial encroachments within the continent of Africa and their subsequent racist attitudes towards Africans as a whole. The transatlantic slave trade succeeded in providing a tragic snapshot of human potential for cruelty that transcended racial lines, benefiting blacks and whites in the process, but unfortunately, those who suffered were exclusively blacks, and the oppressors outside of the African continent were white in most cases. To simplify the blame to just one particular race of people, however, not only fails to mend the wounds of this dark time in human history, but it also serves no purpose other than to perpetuate hate and discontent between people of African descent and European descent, even if neither of their ancestors were involved. Additionally, no whites living within the United States today have any role in the slave trade, and those who had ancestors with slaves are the minority. Only marginal percentages of blacks live in the United States directly contributed to the slave trade, but nearly all are direct descendants of slaves. And those blacks still living in Africa that descend from slave masters live in countries that have more or less failed as a result of their failed slave-dependent economies and their subsequent colonization by European powers. For sources, check out my website, fromnothing.info. High-quality content like this is impossible without the help of my wonderful patrons, sponsors, and channel members. If you like this video and you want to help support future projects, links to do so can be found in the description down below. Or you can just click that notification bell so you'll know whenever I upload any new content. And always remember, we don't come from nothing.